Hi and welcome. I'm Elissa Taub. It's nice to be with you here tonight. I posted on LinkedIn a little bit ago, but not on the other platforms that Greg Siskind is unavailable tonight. So very exciting. You've got me solo for tonight's live stream. And we actually have a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to dive in, or I'm going to dive in. I'm so used to doing these with someone else. It's just like all about we. But tonight it's all about me as I am here with you on my own. So, few housekeeping items as we get started. Of course, this evening's live stream is intended to be for general information purposes. We are not giving individual legal advice during this program. Of course, if you have specific, personal immigration questions, you should definitely check that out with an immigration attorney. Also, I just want to mention I'm getting over a cold. So if I do cough at any time during this program, I apologize. Hopefully, it won't sound too awful. But before we get into the immigration news of the week, I do want to share some updates with regard to litigation and impact litigation. At Siskind Susser, I am not really part of the litigation team that works on the impact cases, so I'm not going to get super into details on those cases. However, it's important to know that Impact is currently onboarding multiple rounds of litigation. Importantly, there is a mandamus suit with regard to delays in the diversity visa lottery application process. And we have also opened up new rounds of registration for the litigation related to the 75 country immigrant visa pause and the 39 country USCIS benefits pause that is all wrapped up in the travel ban. You can find information about those lawsuits, the deadlines, the requirements, and how to sign up and become part of those lawsuits at the Impact onboarding site. And you can see that link right there on your screen. I highly encourage you to check that out. Every case that we're onboarding has an FAQ that you can look at to determine if you're eligible. All of the documentation to sign up is right there. The fees and everything are right there on that site. So I highly recommend that you check that out. It's very exciting. The deadlines for signing up are looming in the next, for I think one of them maybe over the weekend, others in the next couple of weeks. So definitely check those out. The other thing I can report on litigation updates is that I believe tomorrow is Thursday, and there should be a big oral argument in Impact's in the Global Nurse Force litigation challenging the $100,000 H-1B fee. There is a big argument tomorrow in the Northern District of California in San Francisco. So watch out for news coming out of that case. Maybe some news coming out of that after the argument tomorrow. And then potentially, obviously once the judge makes a decision, and there will be more news that comes out about that. So that is my little quick litigation update. As I mentioned, I am definitely not in the weeds of those cases, but wanted to make sure that I shared that important information about cases that are onboarding. You may recall that previously we did onboard cases and filed litigation on the 39 country travel ban, along with that benefits pause at USCIS and the 75 country immigrant visa pause. Like there was a prior round of onboarding in January that's been reopened. And so now there's a new opportunity to sign up, which is important because when these things were first announced in December, January, there may have been a lot of people who weren't yet eligible to file lawsuits because they didn't maybe have cases pending at USCIS yet. And now they do. And so the question was, well, what do we do with those folks? Do they have to file individual cases? Can we add them into a mass case? So Impact has reopened that onboarding. So definitely check that out if you're interested. and if you think you might need or want to join those cases. All right. That's all I'm going to say about litigation tonight, because Lord knows if I talk more, I'll probably get myself in trouble. So let's pivot to this week's news. A lot of really interesting things going on in immigration news. And I don't want to let the time pass without at least having to mention the State of the Union address from last night. I don't know how many of you actually watched it. I did not actually watch it. In fact, the only thing that I watched was I was switching from like one streaming service to another, and my TV got stuck on one of the news channels in between, and my remote control, like the batteries were dead or something. And so right at the beginning of the racist immigration rant, my TV got stuck on the State of the Union, and I was trying so hard to change the channel, and I finally was able to make it happen. And I think that was my big takeaway. There were some reports today, and I was following online, but there were certainly some reports today that maybe focused on the first hour of this speech that was a little bit more, I mean, to the extent that the president can be policy-minded, it was a little bit more policy-minded. But the second section, clearly written by Stephen Miller, was basically a racist anti-immigration tirade. And the president engaged in some political theater where he said, stand up if you believe that the American government should protect American citizens and not illegal immigrants. And, the whole Republican side stood up and clapped, and, they're using that today in some of their like postmortem, day after stuff, to try to paint the Democrats as being like pro illegal immigration somehow. It was theater. It wasn't real. And I think that's also indicative of the fact that that's not the choice, right? Like the choice in American immigration policy isn't between US citizens and illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. There's a huge spectrum of people in between that, right? Like there's green card holders and refugees and people who are here on non-immigrant visas, people who are here legally but aren't US citizens. And I think ultimately most people want our government to act humanely and treat people with respect and dignity, regardless of their immigration status. So interesting, interesting attempt at political theater last night at the State of the Union when it came to immigration. But ultimately not anything surprising given what's been going on in the country for the last year. So hopefully, this State of the Union, I don't think is going to be it's not gonna be one of those speeches that sticks around and becomes like historic or something, so I think most people are moving on from it, and so shall we. So additional news that we can talk about from this week, there is the continued DHS shutdown. You may remember, at the end of January, that there was a deadline around January 20th or so for the government to pass a budget to fund the government, all the government's functions for the rest of this fiscal year that goes through September 30th. And the Democrats said, we'll fund everything, but we're not going to fund the Department of Homeland Security unless the Republicans agree to place some restrictions on how ICE and Border Patrol are conducting themselves in immigration enforcement, right? Wanting to get rid of the use of masks, wanting to ensure that officers have to identify themselves, wanting to say that they need to get judicial warrants to enter private property. Some of the, that's already part of the Fourth Amendment, but whatever. Lots of things that the Democrats want to extract from the Republicans to make immigration enforcement at least like a smidgen more humane, right? Like we're not talking about what many people want, which is to kind of like overhaul the entire agency, get rid of ICE, change up the way that immigration enforcement is done entirely, but just these little things. And the Republicans didn't agree. So DHS currently is unfunded. What does that mean? And we may have talked about this on prior on prior live streams, but just to kind of give an update on what this means. USCIS, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, they're working, they're operating. There have been no disruptions. USCIS, as we've talked about in prior shutdowns, is entirely a fee-funded agency for the most part. So it continues going, right? Every time we file a petition, we're sending in thousands of dollars with it. That funds their operations. So they're continuing to operate. CBP, when you come into the border, right? Like they're still operating. Who's not getting funded? And ICE was funded in the big ugly bill last year. So they've got their funding, right? What is trying to be extracted right now are concessions in the way they operate, but ICE is not unfunded. So who's unfunded? TSA, FEMA, right? Like there are some really important parts of the Department of Homeland Security right now that don't have funding. But they still have to work. Air traffic control, TSA, they still have to go to work and not get paid, which, really stinks. Over the weekend, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they were going to suspend the operation of TSA PreCheck and global entry in light of the shutdown. Now, this is ridiculous. A, because people pay fees for those services. B, because the implementation of those services actually requires fewer agents to have to monitor them. I have global entry. When you enter the United States on global entry, you go through a kiosk. It takes your picture. You don't even do anything with the kiosk anymore. It literally takes your picture, sends your picture over to one agent who identifies you when you walk up and says, "Hello, Ms. Taub." And then they say, "Welcome back to the United States." And you walk in and there's like nothing to do. There's like one or two agents sitting there. Whereas the rest of the people coming in actually need to see an agent. And there's an actual CBP officer that has to sit there. And on the leaving, at least in my airport, there are always fewer TSA agents who are devoted to dealing with PreCheck than there are for regular security. So it was sort of a way to inflict pain on regular people in the hopes that people would complain to their congressmen so that they would get funded. And without the concessions that the Democrats want, it backfired. A lot of people were upset about the PreCheck suspension. It largely never happened. But global entry is still suspended. And I'm on some travel websites online and Facebook pages and things like that. And, people are reporting that they're using mobile passport, which is an option. But that the global entry lines are closed. So hopefully they'll reopen those soon. I think it's kind of dumb, but that's how things go these days. So a few other things that I want to cover. So that's the shutdown. Really no idea when we might see things resume there. I know that there have been some discussions and there have been proposals that have been sent back and forth and things, but nothing so specific where I can say like, oh, I think that there's going to be a vote and this is going to happen. So right now that's just stuck on hold. Shifting gears just a little bit to talk a little bit about refugees and some other like actual news that came out over the course of the last week. I'm looking over here because I've got notes. So I don't forget what I was going to talk about. Last week, a report came out that said that the administration, there was basically a memo that was revealed in some litigation that's ongoing in Minnesota that said that the administration now is planning to detain people who entered the United States as refugees who did not become permanent residents after they were here for a year, as the law allows them to do, and have not presented themselves to DHS to let them know that they're here. This memo and this policy is sort of part of the administration's broader attack on refugees. They essentially have ended the ability of people to enter the United States as refugees unless you're white and from South Africa. And they've already, USCIS already announced a policy of going back and re-reviewing refugee cases. And this memo basically says that while that's happening, if somebody hasn't become a green card holder yet, they can be placed in immigration detention and even be placed in detention while their green card application is going through. if you think about who a refugee is and what they've been through to get to the United States, a refugee is someone who is vetted while they're still outside the U.S. They're abroad. They apply, they go through all the proper channels to be classified as a refugee, meaning that they're somebody who would face persecution if they stay in their home country or return to their home country. And so as a matter of like human rights policy, the United States and many other countries say, we will accept a certain number of refugees annually to kind of save these people, right? To give them a haven and a safe place to be so that they don't have to be in their home country where they might be tortured or killed or whatever for, their on account of their race or their religion or their political opinion or, whatever it is, it's protected. So these folks, have already proven themselves. They've already proven themselves worthy of being called refugees. So there must be some kind of awful thing that happened in their background. They did this while waiting abroad for a long time. Refugees do not get here quickly. They go through multiple rounds of vetting with the assistance of organizations outside the United States. And so when they finally get here, like, oh my gosh, like what a miracle, right? They made it to the United States. And then a year later, a year after they get here as a refugee, they're allowed to apply for a green card on that basis, which then allows them several years later to become U.S. citizens. And it gives them the ability to relocate here permanently and to live here. And the administration is trying to treat these people like criminals. They didn't come here illegally. They didn't sneak into the United States. They are some of the most vetted people that immigrate to the United States, and the ridiculously harsh treatment that this administration is meting out is really uncalled for and unsupportable. I just don't know what else to say about it. So this memo that was revealed last week is just part and parcel of a really cruel policy, taking the most vulnerable and, just subjecting them to inhumane conditions. And then, to the extent that somebody came here as a refugee, like, what are you going to do? You can't send them back to where they came from. And today, actually, there was a court case that said that it's illegal for this administration to remove people to third countries that they've never been to before, have had no contact with, without warning them first or giving them some opportunity to fight that, and with no justification for doing so. So, the government keeps trying to do all of these really cruel things. And thankfully, courts keep telling them that they're being too cruel and that this is not allowed. Sometimes the wheels of justice turn slowly. I think this memo and this policy on refugee detentions is also something that eventually a court is going to get to. But so far, that's just in the offing. So we'll see what happens with that. But really, just awful policy. In better news, NPR reported a few days ago or sometime recently that DHS spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin is leaving the agency. And I say that's good news because if you've been following she was actually, I guess, supposed to leave the agency in December. And then with the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, she stuck around. And, she's the woman who, on a lot of these cases, not just those two, but on other abuses by ICE, she's like the first person out in front of the cameras or out with a tweet saying that it was the victim's fault, right? That they were a terrorist or they tried to attack an officer in some way. And invariably that's a lie, and she's proven to be wrong. So I'm not sorry to see her go. I don't know where she's headed, but bye. So let's see, a few other things. I mean, there's a lot of news. I had a long list today. I was kind of surprised because when I started preparing for tonight, I was like, oh, there really hasn't been that much news. What am I going to talk about by myself for all this time? And then I started making a list and I was like, holy moly, like, there's actually a lot more than I thought. So yesterday, I think it was yesterday, all the days are running together. This week, the Wall Street Journal reported that the administration is thinking about some kind of executive order or other action to require banks to ask all of their customers for citizenship information. And, when when I was starting to read about this and started to look at comments online, people were like, well, my bank already asked me for that. Don't banks already have to ask you for that? And the answer is no. What banks are required to do is confirm your identity in an attempt to thwart money laundering and fraud and things like that. Banks are going to ask you for identity documents. They're not required to ask you about your citizenship status. And, you know, there's no law, there's no requirement that says that somebody has to be a US citizen to have a bank account here. You can be a non-immigrant. A person who is undocumented might have a bank account of some sort. There's no prohibition on that other than what the bank's policies are. But starting to ask people about their citizenship status when they want to open a bank account, and not only that, but potentially banks having to go back and ask all their existing customers for citizenship information, not just new ones, really can have a chilling effect on people's willingness to use banks in the United States. So it's sort of one of these insidious policies that on the surface, a person might say, well, what's wrong with that? Shouldn't we know who has money and bank accounts in the US? And the answer is, well, we already do. But asking for citizenship status could have a chilling effect, could scare some people from wanting to actually put money in the bank. That's not good for the US economy, and further marginalizes people from being able to fully participate in life. And so it's a kind of like another one of those cascading, like cruel policies. It hasn't happened yet. It was rumored. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal first. Maybe the backlash and the commentary will get the administration to change its view on this or change its focus. I sometimes feel like this administration, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, is sort of like Sauron's eye, and it can, it's focused over here for a while, and it's like all focused over here, and then something over, it's like squirrel, and then like all of a sudden the eye's over here, and it's looking at something else. And so, maybe some kind of executive order comes out on the banking and citizenship thing. Maybe not for a while. Maybe there's some other policy that comes out, but keep an eye out for that. I think, I have a lot of issues with that kind of policy, because I think it not only, it's not just about people who are undocumented, but I think it also could have a chilling effect against people who are here legally. And I will say, just on that same, on a related topic, I do hear periodically from clients who are trying to take out a mortgage or other loan, and the bank asks them for proof that they have some kind of solid and kind of long-term status in the US. That's not because they're legally required to ask those questions. That's because the bank is looking at that as risk mitigation, right? Am I going to loan you $400,000 to buy a house, but you are only authorized to be in the United States for another 6 months, and you have no way of extending your stay. And so the bank is looking at that, and they're like, okay, well, if this person can't stay in the US and they want a mortgage to buy a house, how are we going to make sure that our loan gets paid? Right? So that's where that stuff is coming from. I get that. Sometimes the banks ask for nonsensical documents and things that we can't provide because they don't understand immigration law. That's a whole other story. But those questions aren't about proving citizenship per se. It's about mitigating risk. This rumored executive order is more about immigration status, not as much about a bank's own risk. So let's see. A couple other things I want to mention on news, and then I know we have some questions, and we'll get to some of that as well. I want to highlight that there's been some really interesting successful local activism going on all around the country, notably this week in Tennessee and New Hampshire, where local folks got wind that ICE was trying to buy warehouses in certain communities that they wanted to use as massive detention centers for immigrants. And these local areas where this was happening aren't known as like hotbeds of liberalism necessarily, right? They're not necessarily blue areas. But in these cases and in others, the local populace got really incensed. They did not want their town's name, they did not want this going on in their backyard. And so they went to zoning meetings, they lobbied their local officials, and in a few cases, ICE actually stood down and did not purchase the warehouses that they planned to purchase. And they said they were not going to use those facilities, and they would find somewhere else. Um, it's sort of like a good use of the NIMBY effect, right? The not in my backyard effect, uh, for good, like to protect people. We don't want the government to put concentration camps in our town. And so I found that to be a really interesting theme this week. It's gone on in a few different places. I hope people will continue to pay attention in their local communities and to speak up. I even know recently in Mississippi, a local community stopped one of these from coming in. So in places where you wouldn't really think about it, folks don't want this going on in their community. They don't want it in their backyard. They're not happy about this aspect of the administration's immigration policy. And you can see how, that opposition, those views are permeating, even in areas that are traditionally thought of as pretty red areas. So it's very interesting development on the local activism front this past week. And I saw that we had some questions about the March Visa Bulletin. So I just wanted to mention a few things about that. The March Visa Bulletin came out on this week, Monday or Tuesday. I told you all the days are running together. It came out about a week late. I don't know why. There was some big movement on the filing dates chart. EB2 worldwide became current on the filing dates chart, and miraculously, USCIS is still allowing us to use that chart for filing adjustment of status applications going into March. There was even some movement worldwide for EB3. So some really interesting movement on the employment-based side. I will confess I have not done my usual monthly deep dive into the Visa Bulletin yet because I was traveling last week, and I have been furiously trying to catch up in the office since I got back. So I won't go too deep into the Visa Bulletin. What I will say is normally this time of year, we do not see this kind of movement in the filing dates chart. And just for those of you who are not familiar with the Visa Bulletin, who might need a little bit of a refresher, the Visa Bulletin is the publication that the U.S. State Department puts out monthly as a way of managing the green card backlog that is created by the fact that the Congress limits the number of green cards that can be issued each fiscal year. And the limits are very complex. There are limits by category, limits by country, by nationality, all of this. So the Visa Bulletin is where all of that gets managed from an accounting perspective. On the Visa Bulletin, it accounts for the family-based green cards and employment-based green cards. And then for each of those, there are two charts. One called Final Action Chart, which tells us which cases are eligible to be approved in each month. And then the Filing Dates Chart, which tells us who might be eligible to file an adjustment of status application in that month. In other words, who might be able to file the final step of that green card process. The dates on the filing date chart are in a kind of like an accrual. They're an estimate of where the State Department thinks that category is going to go by the end of this fiscal year. So by the end of September, where is that category going to be? The Final Action Chart is about right now. Who can be approved right now? Usually by this point in the year, by the time we get to March, we are only able to use the final action dates for filing cases because the filing date chart, it created too much demand on the system. And so they want to kind of slow down the filing so they don't end up with too much inventory. And we see the final action chart move ahead incrementally, as we go, but not in big leaps and bounds, right? We see the bigger movement usually October and then December, January, March, April, we see some movement, and then it'll move incrementally until the summertime. So I kind of have studied the trends in the Visa Bulletin over the last few years, and this seems to be what happens. And it seems like the State Department doesn't really like to make big changes in between the quarters. So at each fiscal quarter, there tends to be more movement than in the months in between. So this March Visa Bulletin is a little weird. right? I wouldn't have expected maybe bigger changes until April, but I also thought maybe we wouldn't be able to use the filing dates for March. Like there are all these things that my conventional wisdom mind was assuming. But there's some stuff going on, right? Green cards are not just issued by USCIS inside the United States. Green cards are also issued by the State Department at US embassies and consular posts all over the world. And right now, a lot of that is paused on both ends, right? We have the 39 country travel ban that I call it travel ban, but those 39 countries, those folks can't get immigrant visas, which are those green cards issued abroad. There's also the broader 75 country immigrant visa pause, which means that the State Department not only is not issuing green cards abroad for those 39 travel banned countries, but also for the 75 countries in the immigrant visa pause. And then on the other side of things, USCIS has paused adjudications for anybody who's subject to the 39 country travel ban. So if you look at that, there are a lot of green cards that could be issued right now. Family, employment, doesn't matter. These policies cover both. There are a lot of green cards that could be issued both inside and outside the United States right now since, since the first travel ban came out in June and then, that expanded in December. USCIS's benefits pause went into effect around December 4th. The 75 country immigrant visa pause happened January 14th. So as time's gone on, there are all of these green cards that could be issued, but they're not. What does that mean? Well, somebody's got to get those green cards. So you have all these people that may be eligible for a green card. They're all sitting over here, paused. That means that there's some pent up availability, right, for the government to issue green cards to other people who were in the queue. And I think that is what has accounted for EB2 being current on the final action chart for March. That hasn't happened in a few years. EB3 moved ahead in a big way on the filing dates chart. Final action chart, we saw some movement, maybe not quite as much. They're still being pretty conservative in how they're moving that up. But to be able to file green cards for pretty much everybody on my list that's not from India or China was a pretty big shock for March. On the India side of things, I know there's question, with regard to visa availability for Indians. That's a little bit more complicated because that's complicated by the 7% cap. So no country's nationals can account for more than 7% of the green cards that are issued in any particular category. My assumption is, and of course I am not a math major. I don't do accounting. I am so I'm not going to get into the weeds on math here. There's a reason I went to law school. But if I'm kind of thinking about this logically, as they're finding this availability in the green card categories, it goes to the worldwide numbers first. And that 7% cap for India gets hit not just once a year, right? It's like compounding interest, right? It gets hit a lot. I don't think that those numbers are going to essentially stand still. And I think there was a little movement. There was some movement between February and March on the final action chart for EB2 India, because I have a client who's not current in February, but he will be current in March. So there is some movement there. It hasn't just stayed still between February and March. But you should not expect leaps in terms of years there, right? I think just understanding how the State Department views this, they don't want, if you remember October of 2020, and I remember it well because holy moly, that was a crazy month. There was a movement by years all across the visa bulletin, and especially for EB3 India. And we were able to file, I still have clients who file downgrades then whose cases are pending. That's a whole other story. But the State Department provoked so much demand on the system that it created a huge inventory backlog for them. It took them 6 months just to issue receipts in some of those cases because there were so many filed all in 1 month. Thousands of applications were filed in the month of October 2020. They don't want to do that again. It was an absolute disaster. USCIS could not handle the deluge. And so they left that open for filing for a couple of months, clamped it down in January, and then the visa bulletin has never gotten back to where it was then. So I think they learned a lesson. They don't want to do that again. They don't want to move the visa bulletin by that far. Now, they did it in EB2 worldwide right now, but it's not quite the same level of pent-up demand as it is for India, where you have people who've literally been waiting in backlogs for like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years. My non-Indian clients, if they're in a backlog, they barely even notice it, right? Maybe it's a year, 18 months or something like that. So there's pent-up demand, of course, but not the same way and not the same like yearning that we saw with our Indian clients back in 2020. So I would not expect that. That doesn't mean that the visa bulletin won't continue to move forward during this year. And I do believe October 2020 will also be really key. October 2026 will also be a key month. And here's why. So I think we may see some steady movement across the visa bulletin all the way through the rest of this fiscal year. And then going into October 2026, here's my thinking. The thing that provoked that huge movement in October 2020, that crazy visa bulletin, like whatever you want to call it, we were all working from home. It was COVID. We all had masks on. I would go into the office to like bring petition. It was insanity. What provoked that was that during COVID, the US had also banned the issuance of green cards abroad, but they did it across the board, not just only for certain countries. Most of the green cards that are issued to people outside the United States are issued in the family-based green card categories, not employment-based. So there are employment-based green cards handled abroad. The overwhelming majority are on the family side. And through all the complicated accounting, if there is a glut, if there are family numbers that go unused by the end of the fiscal year, for the next fiscal year, those family numbers spill over onto the employment side and give us extra employment-based green cards. And they kind of funnel down through all the categories and all the countries and, all of that. What happened in October 2020 is that because of the COVID visa bans, there was a glut of family-based visas that spilled over onto the employment-based side, and that gave us that October 2020 craziness. Something similar could happen this year because of all the bans and pauses. It's not a worldwide ban, so it's not going to be quite as extreme as it was then. I think by moving the visa bulletin ahead during this fiscal year, they may be trying to hedge against some kind of craziness in October. I don't know that for sure, but that's sort of like stuff that's in the back of my head. But in October, if you're from India, that may be the time, right? That may be the time where you actually see some big movement in the visa bulletin, for India, which is just facing, perennially facing ridiculously long green card backlogs. So that's just kind of like, I want to be kind of general on talking about the visa bulletin. But I do think that I do think that there's some positive, it's one of these things, right? Like one person's pain on the benefits pause and the immigrant visa pause and the travel bans, right? One person's pain on that creates another person's joy in a way, because all of a sudden they might have the opportunity to receive their green card because now some glut has been created. So it's like hard to feel happy about it in a way, because I have clients also who we have pending adjustment of status applications for, and I know that they're not going to be adjudicated because USCIS has paused work on cases, for people from Nigeria and Senegal and places like that. So, that's creating opportunity for other clients to get their green cards. So great. But it feels like a little icky also, because I want to advocate for everybody. And so that's it's kind of a weird situation to be in. But I guess the last thing the last question there is about the 75 country immigrant visa pause, and exactly what the parameters of it it applies to all immigrant visas that are applied for outside the US. So all those green card applications that are processed outside the US, whether it's family or employment, and none of these pauses, neither the travel ban, the USCIS benefits pause, or the immigrant visa pause, nothing has a set end date. It is all open-ended. The government has used different rationales for why they implemented these different pauses and bans. The 39 country travel ban is all like based on security and perceived rates of people overstaying visas and things like that. The immigrant visa ban, the 75 country thing, is based on is purportedly based on the fact that people from those countries are more likely to be a public charge when they immigrate to the US, meaning that they're more likely to want public benefits. So, you know, the rationale for the different bans is a little bit different, and hard to know exactly what the government wants to see in order to lift the ban. When they came out with the revised travel ban in December that went into effect on January 1st, they did kind of shift Turkmenistan from the full ban list to the partial ban list. And I feel like that was sort of like a, hey, look, we're being super reasonable. Look how nice we were to Turkmenistan. And it's like, okay, but then you added Nigeria and, you know, like all these other countries to the travel ban, either partial or full. So I'm not really feeling the reasonableness. But at any rate, that's what so we do not know when those are going to end. As I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, you know, there is ongoing litigation on both of the pauses. And while the onboarding for those previously shut down, it has been reopened. And if you go to the site, the link is now on your screen. There is a link there where you can find all the information out about impact litigations, ongoing cases trying to challenge both the 39 country travel ban and the USCIS benefits pause on that side of things, and the 75 country immigrant visa pause on the Department of State side of things. There is, you know, I know there's a lot of confusion about all of that. And even amongst immigration attorneys, you should see what goes on in some of my email listservs and the circular conversations that happen. There's a lot of confusion, and rightfully so, right? There's just these types of things are very much in the details. And sometimes you have a case where you're trying to figure out, like, what's going to happen? What rules apply? You know, how do I advise my client? And you start to look through all of these things and you start to parse the words, realizing that this administration does not write things super carefully. And, you know, it can lead you to, like, in your own brain, like, go around in circles trying to figure out exactly what applies. So, you know, I think if you have an immigration attorney and you're like, I don't know if this pause applies to me, I don't know if I can travel, I don't know if, you know, if my attorney files my citizenship application, what's going to happen to it, you know, all of that. I mean, I think those are great questions to ask. I get peppered with those questions all day long. And, you know, I like when I can write back and say, no, don't worry about this. It doesn't apply to you. You don't have to worry about it. You know, the immigrant visa pause is only immigrant visas. It doesn't apply to H's and O's and L's and all of that stuff. So, you know, I like when I can just, like, give someone comfort that, that they're, you know, that they're okay. And then other times we have to talk more, more specifically about, how these things apply and, what the parameters of them are. There was a conversation I was having with some other attorneys this week about, you have somebody who has dual nationality and there are all of these other things going on, and exactly, like, how do you navigate, between all of these different confusing and sometimes conflicting policies? So it can definitely be a challenge. Okay. By myself, I took up 45 minutes tonight on this live stream, and I have to say I'm feeling really good about that. I think we covered a lot of ground, and we had some good questions. And it is a really weird thing to like talk to yourself in a camera. um, so I think this is like the first time I've ever done one of these by myself. So that was kind of fun. So I am going to close things down there. If anybody has like any last minute questions, I'm happy to entertain them. But otherwise, I am going to bid you all a lovely evening. And I hope you have a great night, and we will see you again next week. Incidentally, I think I'm on next week's too. Hopefully I will have a partner in crime for that one, so you don't just have to listen to my voice. But I wish you all a lovely evening. Bye-bye.